you very much for the kind words and the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak to all of you tonight within this lecture series that I've become quite familiar with over the years. And my topic for tonight, as the title suggests, I'm going to talk about reading the Bible with style. And before we start doing that, I'm going to share my screen, because I have some text fragments and some quotes I'd like to share with you throughout my talk. So if all goes well, you should be able to see this. Okay. So, when I say we're going to talk about reading the Bible with style, I'm obviously not talking about reading the text or about fancy outfits we're going to wear when reading the text, nor about features that have often been discussed in terms of stylistic devices in rhetorical or literary studies. Rather, when I use the term style, I refer to the overall appearance of the text, growing from the choice of words and their belonging to a particular semantic domain, to the text worlds created by readers based on textual cues, as well as extra textual discourse world information. In my talk, I will argue that the style of the biblical text carries great meaning, and that tracking it throughout a reading of the text offers valuable insight both into the text itself and its rich interpretation history. In what follows, I will first discuss the role of methodology and the place of reading in biblical studies before introducing cognitive stylistics as an approach. Afterwards, I will illustrate the sense of style with various examples. In conclusion, I will present to you in avant-premiere the podcast I made on this topic, which will be launched tomorrow on Spotify. The podcast accompanies the book, How We Read the Bible, A Guide to Scripture Style and Meaning, which I co-authored with Elizabeth Hayes and which will appear in May. So before we get to the fun part, the serious work first. So when we talk about biblical studies and biblical scholarship, we see that this field has a somewhat ambiguous relationship with methodology. For a very long time, up until the Enlightenment, studies on the biblical text were colored by the theology of its interpreters. During the Renaissance, perspectives started to change with the rise of Bible translations in the vernaculars, which itself prompted a renewed interest in Hebrew and Greek texts and their manuscripts, an interest in other classics and their approaches, and the growing role of reason in other disciplines such as philosophy and science in general. This eventually resulted in various historical-oriented methods that treated the Hebrew Bible and the Bible in general as any other ancient document. For example, source criticism aimed to uncover the underlying sources of the text. Form criticism looked for the genre forms and their Sitz im Leben, and the redaction criticism was interested in how the text as we have it came together. As Stephen Moore and Yvonne Sherwood have pointed out, methodology has long been the sine qua non of biblical studies as an academic discipline. Methodology is what is meant to keep our discourse on the Bible from being subjective, personal, private, pietistic, pastoral, devotional, or homiletical. Methodology is what is meant to maintain the dividing partition between sermon and scholarship and prevent the lecture's podium from morphing into a pulpit. End of the quote. These historical approaches of the Bible dominated and to a certain degree still dominate the field of biblical studies. However, in the second half of the previous century, a new divide was created, that between historical and literary research, a divide that led the way to the adoption of a whole string of isms in biblical scholarship, going from structuralism and reader response criticism to post-colonial criticism, gender criticism, and eco-criticism. According to Moore and Sherwood, biblical studies suffers from method madness, a condition that has worsened since theory with capital T, as in high theory based on the work of Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, Roland Barthes, Judith Butler, to name just a few, entered the scene. And I quote again, what defines the biblical studies discipline is less that it possesses method than that it is obsessed with method, and as such possessed by method. Biblical scholarship seems to turn everything it touches into method. End of the quote. Yet one should not be fooled. The rise of new methodologies has not truly nor necessarily opposed, let alone replaced, the historical critical paradigm. One sees, for example, a historical turn in literary scholarship and a reader-oriented work that refocuses on the historical authors and audience rather than on real current-day readers. In addition, methodology does not lead by definition to innovative scholarship, but possibly to uninspired and uncritical imposing of popular frameworks to the biblical text. To quote Moore and Sherwood once more, our quarantining of the biblical critical from the homiletical has not occurred without cost. Most obviously, our obsession with method has made for a mountainous excess of dull and dreary books, essays, and articles. Here, first in numbing dry detail is my method. Now watch and be amazed while I apply it wooingly to this unsuspecting biblical text. End of the quote. Despite the individual differences, though, all studies of the biblical text require an act of reading, meaning a person sitting down with the text and meticulously working their way through it. This process takes place regardless of the chosen method or framework. What's more, reading is what unites the literary scholar and the historian. It forms a shared practice between the scholar and the believer. This begs the question whether scholarship should not pay more attention to this engagement between text and reader. What happens when a person goes from single words on a page to imagining the worlds evoked in the biblical text? Which elements contribute to this world building? To which degree are they shared by individual readers? Where do cultural and personal differences come in? Does it matter whether the character of God is portrayed, say, as a shepherd or as a warrior? What's the influence of deixis, the set of words that are dependent on their context of usage for meaning? If metaphors and metonymies are conceptual images, how can and do readers make sense of them if these images are at odds with the ones ingrained in their own culture? Do we build worlds as we read? Or is the biblical text, as Sternberg once said, a foolproof composition that significantly directs readers' interpretation process? All these questions are at the heart of a discipline called cognitive stylistics. At the crossroads of literary and linguistic studies, it adds insights from cognitive science in order to unravel the mechanisms of reading. The field draws on several theories and methods, all of which share the triad of language, text, and mind. Elena Semino defines it as follows. It's a combination of the detailed analysis of linguistic choices and patterns in text with a systematic consideration of the mental processes and representations that are involved in the process of interpretation. Within cognitive poetics, which is itself a synonym for cognitive stylistics, literary reading is assumed to involve the same mental processes and representations that are involved in comprehension generally. However, special attention is paid to linguistic creativity and its interpretation, since creativity is a central part of the literary experience, even though it is not an exclusively literary phenomenon. End of the quote. In the Cambridge Handbook of Stylistics, Katie Wales emphasizes the role of the cognitive focus in this approach. She furthermore notes that it has as much in common with linguistics, with its attention for language and how it works, as with literary studies in which close reading is important. Gibbons and Whiteley, in their contemporary stylistics, explicitly identify cognitive stylistics as a subdiscipline of cognitive linguistics. Stylistics is centrally concerned with the interactions between the language of a text and a reader of that text. Combining the study of language with the study of the mind suggests that more can be understood about how that interaction between text and reader occurs and why particular effects are produced. End of the quote. Whereas cognitive stylistics might be hard to pigeonhole in the disciplinary landscape, its main premises and ruling methodologies are straightforward. With a broader field of stylistics, it forms an integrated study of language and literature. Similar to cognitive linguistics, it turns to cognitive science to better understand the interaction between a text and its readers. Thus, it starts from the idea that language is embodied. In other words, our bodily state in the world as human beings affects how we think and speak. Furthermore, cognitive stylistics states that all language is equal, meaning that everyday discourse and, say, the language of the Hebrew Bible work in the same way. At the same time, it acknowledges that writers can purposefully and creatively play with schemas and conceptual metaphors, for example. When a city is portrayed as God's spouse, this evokes far different associations and responses from readers compared to a depiction of the same place as a mountain. Finally, context is key, both the context in the text and that existing outside of the text. Textual theory, one of the theories within cognitive stylistics, refers to these as text world and discourse world, the world in which characters live and act on the one hand, and the world in which a reader engages with the text on the other. For written text, including the Hebrew Bible, the latter is split by definition into an original discourse world reconstructed through socio-historical and comparative research, and a later discourse world, that of the scholar and or the discourse world they study. So let us turn to some examples now to illustrate how cognitive stylistics works exactly and what it may contribute to the field of Hebrew Bible scholarship. And I've selected 3 concepts which come from 3 theories that I'd like to introduce to you tonight. And the first concept is prototypes. So when people read, they categorize. They wonder to which group something or someone belongs. What's more, they not only figure out whether, for example, Isaac is a child, but also how much of a child he is. In order to answer that questions, readers compare Isaac with their best example of a child, called a prototype. This prototype forms the basis of their classification and functions as a reference point to categorize other children. The distance or proximity to this prototypical child will determine how well Isaac fits the category of children. A prototype is a mental picture based on all the children one has met, read about, and heard about in life. It's not a fixed image, but one that undergoes refinement and changes over time. Prototypes come with attributes, that is, identifying characteristics. For a child, such would be underage, naive, little to no responsibility, someone in need of a guardian, and so on. However, members of a category do not have to share all the features of the best example. Rather, membership is defined in terms of degree. To visualize prototypicality, scholars use a radial structure as the one you see on the slide. In the center, the best example of the category, the prototype, is found. Around it, all other manifestations of the category are placed. Close resemblance to the prototype results in a position near to the center. Slight resemblance leads to a position at the outskirts. The boundaries of the category are fuzzy, meaning that it's unclear where a category ends and a new one begins. So in the example I show you, we see, for example, the baby in Solomon's judgment would fit our child prototype more closely than, say, Isaac, Cain, or Abel, although they all are introduced in the story originally as children, but then it changes throughout. So categorization not only happens for characters, but it happens on all the levels of language. And one of the levels, and that's my first example, is what I call the micro level of the verse. So when we talk about, for example, parallelism. So parallelism is one of the key features of biblical poetry, and it's a repetition of the structure or content of a line in the next line of the text. And as an example, I have the opening of Psalm 93 here, where we have Adonai Malach, Geut Lavesh Adonai, Os Hitazar, Aftichon Tevel Baltimot. So the Lord, he reigns with height, he's dressed the Lord with strength, he's girded, it stands firm, the world, it will not totter. So in my translation, I've tried to give you the what we have in the Hebrew. So lines 2 and 4 are parallel in structure. They both have a non-verbal part followed by a verb. With height, with strength, he's dressed, he's girded. And what's more, they're also parallel in content, expressing the same idea with different words. Height and strength function as synonyms, as do dressing and girding. Lines 5 and 6 are parallel in content, but not in structure. If the world stands firm, it means it will indeed not totter. Lines 1 and 3 are not parallel at first sight, whereas the dress can be considered a signal of God's kingship and thus a parallel in content to some degree, such is not true for the structure. Line map that out as a radial structure, you'll see that the prototype tells us that the parallelism between lines 2 and 4 is a strong example with a parallelism in both content and structure. And the other examples will still be categorized as parallelism, but they will be further away from the center. And as readers go through biblical poetry, they will adapt their idea of what the best example of a parallelism is. And so one can say that some lines are more parallel than others, rather than trying to distinguish between synonymous parallelism and structural parallelism, which is what people have done in the past. So next example is an example of a mid-level category. So another level in which we categorize is in terms of genre of passages and texts. And so I have here verses from Psalm 23 and Psalm 13. And Psalm 23 forms a central example of the category of thanksgiving psalms. With its opening, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." In comparison, Psalm 13 presents a speaker who feels abandoned and lonely. At Ana Adonai tishkaheni netzach. How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? In the closing lines of the same psalm, though, the psalmist expresses his trust in God and sings his praise. "I will sing to the Lord because he has been good to me." So Psalm 13 belongs to at least two categories, although overall it may be a better example of lament than of thanksgiving. And then a last example is on even broader category, that of text world level. So when we read the patriarchal narratives, we immerse ourselves in this story world, and according to cognitive stylistics, or the cognitive stylistics calls this the text world of the narrative. And this text world is built by the reader drawing on information from the text, such as time, location, characters, and objects, but it's also informed by knowledge and experience of that reader. A text world is dynamic, meaning that it evolves as the story progresses and new information is added. And sometimes a new text world is created called a subworld or world switch. And this can happen when eideictic shifts take place. So when we get a shift in time and or location, can also happen when a character expresses a need or a belief. So as an example, think of a eideictic shift would be, I'm giving my talk, and then we say, meanwhile in Antwerp, that would be a eideictic shift. And then somebody's going to tell what's happening at the same time in Antwerp, because I'm not currently in Antwerp. Examples of the world switch with need and belief would be, I hope that the internet connection is good, so I express my desire, and I believe that you're muted would be me expressing a belief. So the last two examples of hoping and believing create modal subworlds. So we're talking about modality, and in textual theory, they have some terms for that. They call it boulimic and epistemic worlds. So returning to the biblical text, then, we see that in the patriarchal narratives, and the example I have up here is from Genesis 12, which is when Abraham leaves his home and sets out on his journey to the promised land. We see that in this story, but also in the stories of the other patriarchs, that we get very little boulimic subworlds. So in other words, only occasionally characters express their desires, dreams, and wishes. What's more, when they do, they voice God's dreams and wishes, not their own. Typical examples are the visionary dreams of the patriarchs. So the subworld created then is not the character's personal opinion about a hypothetical reality, but God's. In terms of prototypicality, and before I move on, I'll show you an example. So this is Genesis 28, Jacob. So we get this dream, and then in this dream, basically we are introduced in a world that expresses what God wants and what God would like to happen, rather than what the character itself needs or wishes. So in terms of prototypicality, one could say that the boulimic worlds in the patriarchal narratives are non-prototypical or peripheral. However, because all boulimic subworlds seem to behave in the same way, the argument could be made that the biblical prototype of a boulimic subworld in the patriarchal narratives is one in which a character expresses the divine desires rather than their own. Whatever perspective one takes, the biblical text or the modern readers, the fact remains that there is a tension between prototypical subworlds as perceived by the reader and as conceived by the text. Why is this important? Well, it helps us to understand why modern readers ask about, for instance, Sarah's feelings in what she wants when Isaac was taken to be sacrificed in Genesis 22 in terms of modality, a Boulomaic subworld of the character, and a question following the prototype of the reader as just described. At the same time, readers will not find an answer in the text, not even between the lines, precisely because the prototypical Boulomaic subworld of the text is concerned with the divine character's desires. And for sure, the text tells us in many ways what this divine character wants. Testing Abraham, a sacrifice, a replacement sacrifice, ultimately believe and trust. In other words, a prototypical analysis, of which I just gave a very rough one, helps readers to find the questions that are answered by the text through an understanding of the categorizations that are embedded in the text. It also points out that these categorizations may differ from our own and how the latter may influence the questions we ask, as well as the answers we're looking for. So deciding about the genre of the Bible, the genre of a specific text, or the relations between texts is part of the reading process. And prototypes help us understand how these decisions are made and what influences them. More specifically, prototypicality teaches us about the flexibility and fluidity of categories. If the Bible is classified as literature, it does not mean that it can no longer be identified as a document of faith. King David can still fit our category of leader, even when he sleeps with Bathsheba or sends her husband to a sudden death. Prototypes come in particularly handy for the study of all those passages and issues that are considered problematic. There are many texts that do not fit the category assigned to them. There are plenty of stories where heroes, for example, do unheroic things. Prototypes are a tool to reassess categories, and this at various levels. On the micro level, one can think of categories as hero or the divine. When readers come across the story of Samson in Judges, how would they classify him? Is he a hero? Where would he be positioned in a radial structure of this category? In order to understand the reading of Samson as character, one should also consider the prototypes of the reader's world. Obviously, the 21st century Western idea of a hero is different from that of the patriarchal society in which the story is set. How does the hero prototype of the reader affect the categorization of Samson? And ultimately, how does it influence the reading and the understanding of the Samson narrative? Another example would be the genre of the Book of Jonah, which has been labeled variously as comedy, parody, fiction, or parable. The list of labels already suggests that this text may benefit from a prototypical approach. It makes more sense to call the text kind of a parody and slightly fictional. This formulation indicates two things. For one, that the Jonah text belongs to at least two categories, that of parody and that of fiction, and that it is for neither category the best example, thus the prototype, but nevertheless a member of that category. Again, the categorization of the Jonah text can be set against the socio-cultural context of the reader. What is fiction in ancient setting, and what does the category look like today? Similarly, would a South Korean reader of Jonah consider Jonah fiction? And if so, would the radial structure of that category be similar to that of a French reader or an American one? So that's on the first topic. As a second topic, I would like to talk about figure-ground dynamics, which are also part of cognitive stylistics. So figure and ground are two concepts that describe the position of an object, called a figure, against its surroundings, the ground. Typically, the figure is what draws our attention, whereas the ground is mostly neglected. Figure and ground are mobile categories, meaning that we can shift our attention or can be directed to a shift so that another item becomes a figure and the original figure disappears in the background. Visually, the concepts are illustrated with images as the one I just showed you. Viewers can focus on the fruit or on the vase. They can also shift from one image to the other, switching the positions of figure and ground between fruit and vase. Similarly, this also works on the text level. The book of Jonah opens with God and his prophecy as figure. Jonah is only ground at that point. He's there, but the narrator draws our attention to what God has to say. Our gaze shifts to Jonah when he does not follow God's command. Where is he going? What is he doing? We as readers which you did not make great, which appeared overnight, perished overnight, and I should not care about Nineveh, that great city in which there are more than 120,000 people who do not know their right hand from their left, and so on. So verses 10 and 11 are composed in a parallel way. Both open with a personal pronoun, ata and ani, followed by the same verb and a prepositional phrase. Note that contrary to English, Biblical Hebrew does not need to express subjects when they're personal pronouns because they're included in the verbal form. Explicitly mentioning personal pronouns emphasizes the subject. In this particular case, doing this twice draws attention to the parallelism between both verses. The parallel structure also continues after the first line with two relative clauses introduced by which in verse 10 and in which and who in verse 11. Again, the parallelism is stronger in Hebrew because there's only one relative pronoun, asher, all but one place here. The last form is the less frequently one, it's the by form, she. So in addition, there are repeated roots, such as in the verb to make great, gadal, in verse 10, and the adjective gadolah, great, in verse 11, and similar sounding words for overnight, bin laila in verse 10, and bin in verse 11 for from. All of these unexpected repetitions catch the reader's attention and foreground the similarity between Jonah's relation to the plant and God's relation to Nineveh. Possible differences disappear in the background, even though many a commentator has written about them. And such is not surprising because the parallel structure, on a closer look, of course, does not coincide with parallel content. For one, the underlying rhetorical argument is not a proper parallelism, but a minus ad maiore argument. If something counts for a small matter, it definitely counts for something big. Thus, if Jonah cares about something as futile as a single plant with a short life, the more should God care about something as big as the city of Nineveh, which is ancient. Secondly, the verse about Jonah is a statement, whereas the lines about God are a rhetorical question with a negation. Should God not care? The answer is obviously that he should. Scholarship has labeled the contrast in content between the verse about Jonah and the verse about God as an anti-parallelism. And thirdly, verse 11 actually lacks a semantic parallel for most of verse 10, namely that God worked for Nineveh versus Jonah did not work for the plant, and that it was an ancient city versus the plant had a short lifespan. Although scholars have listed all these differences, all of them are grounds against the following figure, that God's position can be understood in light of Jonah's experience. In other words, the narrator explains God's reasoning through comparison with Jonah's thinking. And the very fact that people focus on all these differences in their comparison, of course, has to do with the fact that it's no longer first reading. So it's the parallelism or between the two verses works the strongest when you come across the text for the first time. But if you start like working on the text and scrutinizing it, then of course you see that besides similarities, there's also differences. So then the normal working of the figure ground dynamics basically it kind of disappears. So and that's where the scholarship comes from to a certain degree. So scholars as other readers pay attention to figures naturally when reading and interpreting the Bible. And the incorporation of the ground aspect and the dynamics between figure and ground in these readings can further enrich our understanding of the biblical text. Self-evidently, the foregrounded element is still the part that draws our attention and is endowed with significance. But where did it come from and where does it go as the story progresses? What's backgrounded when this figure appears? And what's the relationship between figure and ground? More generally, figure and ground allow us to track the focus of a text. Researchers can take this focus into account when establishing their research questions. Some questions in particular will benefit from a figure ground analysis. Think of questions about silencing certain voices in the text, like those of women, children, exiles, and the people as collective. In the famous story of David and Bathsheba in 2 Samuel 11, figure and ground can shed new light on Bathsheba's position in the story, as well as on the dynamics with David. When does the reader focus on her? When does she become a figure? And what is the husband's position in the schema? How is all of this achieved textually? Also, questions regarding dominant stylistic features of the text, such as parallelism, can be analyzed anew with figure and ground. When and how are parallelisms broken? How does the reader's eye move in biblical poetry, where various elements may qualify as figures? And what forms the ground in these texts? In biblical narrative, it's possible to follow a certain character to its positions as figure and ground. When do changes occur? And do these different positions involve character development as well? And so as a last example, group of examples, I would like to talk about conceptual metonymy. And the example I have here is from 1 Samuel 4. So where the Israelites and the Philistines have a conflict, and the Israelites decide to bring back the Ark of the Covenant to the camp to turn the outcome of the battle in their favor. And their reasoning is as follows: if the Ark is here, God will be here, and then all will be well. And indeed, when the Philistines hear about the Ark being in the camp of the Israelites, they're afraid for, and I quote 1 Samuel verse 6, God has come to the camp. Unexpectedly, however, the Philistines win the battle and take the Ark with them, which results in some unpleasant events. After all, it's not just the Ark they've moved, but also God. The story of the Ark illustrates an important process for reading, that of mapping related categories unto each other. This prompts the Israelites to first speak of the Ark and consequently replace this by God. Similarly, the Philistines connect the presence of the Ark to the presence of God in the camp. Scholars call this transfer from one category into another within a single conceptual domain metonymy. Metonymy expresses a stance for relationship. The Ark of the Covenant in 1 Samuel 4-6 stands for God. The Ark is the vehicle entity or the source, and God is the target entity. In the particular case of the Ark and God, one could categorize this relationship more generally as an example of location for being. There are many types of metonymies, and some scholars group them more broadly into three categories based on spatial, temporal, and causal relationships. Others produce extensive lists of up to 46 different types of metonymy. The most common types are part for whole, whole for part, and cause for effect. I'll give you another example. In 1 Samuel 1, when Elkanah asks his wife Hannah why she is sad at the opening of the chapter, he says, literally, why is your heart sad? And obviously, he wants to know why Hannah, as a person, is upset rather than what's wrong with her heart. This is an example of a body part for person metonymy. Note that most English translations render the verse just as, why are you sad? So they kind of already worked through that metonymy. It doesn't even bother them, right? So metonymy is about relationality, which means that it's closely related to the other major conceptual feature that draws on relationships, metaphor. What's more, scholars nowadays think that metonymy may be more fundamental than metaphor. For example, when God is angry in the Hebrew Bible, the writers use the expression, his nose became warm. They rely on the conceptual metonymy effect for cause. Here, a warm nose, or body heat more generally, for anger. This evolves into the conceptual metaphor, anger is heat. This connection between metonymies and metaphors seems to be especially at work in cause-effect and whole-part relationships. So whereas metonymy and metaphor are clearly related, they also have their differences. And the most important difference is that metonymy happens within one conceptual domain, whereas metaphor connects to separate conceptual domains. And to return to the sad Hannah in 1 Samuel 1, her heart and person are both part of the same conceptual domain. So we're dealing with a metonymy. On the contrary, when Hannah thanks God in 1 Samuel 2, when dedicating her son, she says, there is no rock like our God. The rock and God form two different conceptual domains. They're connected because they share notions such as strength, solidity, and so on. The rock is not part of God, and it's also not a location representing God. In fact, it's Hannah who draws our attention to the possible connection between the rock and God. Another distinction is that metonymy is about contiguity, while metaphors dealing with similarity. Or more precisely, metonymy is about likeness of things that are already alike, such as a body part and a person, and metaphor on the opposite is generating similarity between things that are not by definition alike, such as a rock and a divine being. A third difference has to do with the linguistic levels on which metaphor and metonymy work. Metaphor only works between two spaces, whereas metonymy can work on the three levels of the linguistic sign, so on the word level, on the concept level, and on the referent level. So if we have the word heart, for example, that would be the word heart in the text. The concept would be the organ that rules the bloodstream, and the referent would be then a real heart in the world. And I'll give you an example. So Again, in 1 Samuel 2, Hannah says, "My heart rejoices in the Lord." So we have two metonymies here, the body part for person, which we already encountered before. Hannah's happiness is like her grief expressed by using a body part rather than her whole person. It goes without saying that Hannah herself is also praising the Lord and not just her heart. Both the heart and Hannah are part of the conceptual domain human being. So the metonymy takes place on the concept level. In addition, there's a second metonymy with Hannah rejoicing in the Lord. Whereas Hannah surely feels the character God's presence, the very fact of her praying suggests that the character is not standing next to her to celebrate. Rather, the word God functions here as a metonymy for both the concept of the divine as well as an extra-textual divine being, at least for readers who believe. In this case, the metonymy combines elements from the form realm, the concept realm, and even the reference realm. And as a last distinction, we see that, or scholars find that metonymy is more focused on directing attention, while metaphor is primarily about understanding one thing through another. In other words, mentioning Hannah's heart rather than her whole person turns our attention to the emotional aspect of the phrase. It's not that we really need this reference to the heart to understand that when Hannah is sad, it's a matter of the heart rather than of the brain. In contrast, speaking of God in terms of a rock is precisely what facilitates the understanding of God. The comparison's prime objective is to help us comprehend God. Finally, metonymy and metaphor often appear together in text. They reinforce each other. In Hannah's prayer, metonymies such as the above, the body part for person and the word for concept occur, but also metaphors such as God is a rock and God is a person. Every single one of them gives information to the reader, helping to construe what the text means. So as a final example, let us look at 1 Samuel 5, where the Philistines take the Ark of the Covenant to the temple of Dagon, their god. As long as the Ark is sitting in the temple, the statue of Dagon falls over several times. In addition, the community is affected by disease. The people decide to move the Ark to a different place, to Ekron. However, the people there are afraid the same will happen to them. So the story includes several examples of metonymy, beginning with that of the name of the god Dagon for its statue. So a name for a statue. The first mention of Dagon in verse 2 refers to the god, but the second one to a cult statue of that god. Readers easily make that transfer because the god and the statue are part of the same conceptual domain of deity. Similarly, readers understand that the Dagon lying face down in verse 3 is a statue and not the god himself. At the same time, the statue is not just a statue, but represents the extra-textual deity. In that respect, the metonymy of Dagon crosses the realms of the linguistic sign. It's precisely because the statue is also the deity that the Philistines are so upset. This example not only gives us insight in ancient belief, but also shows an awareness of the biblical authors of metonymies and in extension language's power to affect not only the statue or the name of the god, but also the god himself. Another metonymy appears in verse 7 with God's hand dealing with the people and Dagon. Obviously, it's not the hand, but the being to whom the hand belongs that is affecting them. Here we have an example of a body part for being. The expression, the hand of the Lord in verse 6, assists readers in making this transfer. The metonymy creates textual coherence because it picks up an expression that has been used before and adapts it. What's more, the hand is also metaphorically connected to power in the Bible. Therefore, singling out the hand of God rather than another body part of God as a whole directs the reader's attention to God's supremacy. Note that this metonymy of the hand draws on a personification of God. God is understood as a person with body parts like human beings. This example shows that metonymy and metaphor indeed can occur hand in hand. It also illustrates the idea of metonymic agency. In the Bible, God's hand is very often representing and acting as stand-in for God. In verse 10, a location for being metonymy is used when the ark is set to slay, or rather, preferably not slay, the people of Ekron. In addition, a second metonymy appears when the city is mentioned rather than its inhabitants, which would be a place for people. Self-evidently, the people are panicking and not the built city. Similarly, in verse 12, the word city stands for inhabitants, and even heaven could be said to stand for God there. Both metonymies are of the type location for being. So none of the discussed metonymies will come across to readers as particularly rhetorical or literary. This is partly because the text we're looking at is written in prose rather than poetry. The metonymies do not aim to embellish the text, but to guide reading. They focus readers' attention to deities and people through metonymic relationships with names, body parts, and locations. As far as the deities go, the metonymic expressions most certainly also aim to clarify these deities for the reader, at least as far as their contribution to the story goes. For example, the focus on God's hand draws attention to his power. Likewise, mentioning heaven focuses on the supreme position of God. One last thing to take away from this example is that the metonymies used for deities are similar to the ones for non-divine beings. The body part for being metonymy is the same as the one we've seen for Hannah in 1 Samuel 1 and 2, and the location for being metonymy at the end of the chapter appears for both the inhabitants of the city and for God. So looking more closely at metonymy helps to understand how the biblical text produces meaning and how readers come to a particular interpretation of the text. There are a few areas where metonymy may be of use. First and foremost, metonymy appears all over when the Bible features the divine character God. God is compared to a plethora of things, a rock, a father, a shepherd, all metaphors, and represented by stand-ins such as his hand, his height, his role as creator, and his word, all metonymies. A study of these examples and their occurrence will shed light on the biblical author's idea about God. It shows how they deal with a special divine character in a narrative world that is human. The study of other biblical characters, especially, but not solely prophets, and the metonymies used for them can lead to new insights regarding their position. Which metonymies are used for which characters? For example, do prophets share certain metonymies with God? But also, do the metonymies for God change over time or depend on the biblical book chosen? Another area that displays many metonymies is the realm of emotions. Emotional scenes often feature metonymy. Questions to be asked here are there patterns to be distinguished? For example, when do authors turn to metonymy and when to metaphor? And if patterns exist, do they run throughout the whole Bible or only parts of it? Is it only hearts that are happy or sad? Or do we find other body parts or even other metonymies to express these specific emotions? And as a constantly returning issue, do the metonymies make sense to modern day readers or are they cultural specific? We may feel happiness in our hearts, but do we also think in our hearts as the biblical text goes? Or would that rather be our mind or our brain? So with all of the examples that I've shown to you tonight, I wanted to illustrate how cognitive stylistics and its concepts can assist in reading the Hebrew Bible. Rather than another method to add to the madness to use Morse words, I see great potential in its compatibility with existing methods and its focus on the act of reading, an aspect taken for granted far too easily. It allows for meticulous textual scholarship and hermeneutics that characterize much of biblical scholarship, for challenging existing interpretations and categorizations, and for engaging and contributing to meta debates on the nature of, for example, biblical poetry, orality, or the canon. In conclusion, I would like to play the podcast episode I mentioned at the beginning, which summarizes as well as elaborates on some of the things I've mentioned tonight. And if all goes well, you should be able to hear this.
By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and there we wept when we remembered Zion. O daughter Babylon, you devastator, happy shall they be who pay you back what you have done to us. Happy shall they be who take your little ones and dash them against the rocks.
I think the last sentence, it's either rather horrible, I think, dash them against the rock. So I think that's, yeah.
It's a bit like the big bad Babylon against the great good Jerusalem.
I think that's about hurting someone and
they ask for kind of a revenge.
Well, it's hard not to be struck by the final images of the babies against the rocks.
Why is it that people are drawn to the same passage in this biblical text? Is it the rhetoric and the power of language? Is it the cruelty of the scene which unlocks fears or desires in a listener? And why do people seem to evaluate the Psalms' end in very similar ways? Is it because the text has one meaning? Is it because violence is something universal? What actually happens when we read the Bible?
The idea of how we read the Bible is basically acknowledging that we read it conceptually.
Reading is a very complex process, and it's a combination of, or it's a bringing together of the reader, the text, and the context. These are Elizabeth Hayes and Karolien Vermeulen, two biblical scholars discussing how you read the Bible, which happens to be also the title of their latest book. And scholars distinguish two important processes that come together in reading a text, a top-down process and a bottom-up process. And the bottom-up process is the process typically focused on in biblical scholarship. It's the process where you look very closely at the text and look at the words that are used and the phrases that are formed, and you try to make sense of those, very often within the context of the ancient Near East, whereas what is paid less attention to is the top-down process, and that's the process where your reader comes in. And it doesn't matter what kind of reader, we just need to know, like, it's a specific reader reading in a specific place and specific time. And so for our current audience, it would be the 21st century reader who is coming to the text. And this person is not only coming to the text with background knowledge and with things that can be looked up, but it also coming to the text with practical knowledge, with experiential knowledge, with things this person has gone through themselves, things they've seen, they've heard, they've read, they've witnessed, but also beliefs, expectations. So it's a very broad category of knowledge and information that a reader brings to the text, and it's this coming together with what actually is in the text that makes eventually what we call in the book the text world. Wait a minute, let's rewind a bit. So reading about Babylon's babies is not just about the words in the text, it's also about the people who wrote the text calling out God for a response. And it's about the later readers of the text with their own view on revenge and killing babies. This sounds very complicated to assess.
People will recognize some of the places where we start, and then they can also benefit from some of the places that are a little bit less familiar by understanding that not only do we think that way, but the biblical writers also thought that way. And a lot of that has to do with this idea of embodiment and how much of our language comes out of embodied experience in the world and that kind of thing. So I think that's the biggest add that the book can give to biblical interpretation and reading, is understanding how we may be quite far from the original readers and the original writers, but we're quite similar in the way we go about living in the world. And so we have a lot of points of contact as well.
In that respect, we are very close to that text, and that's also why we can still appreciate it so much and we can connect to it, whereas we may live in very different worlds. In other words, readers relate to the babies of Babylon because they both have bodies that can be heard. Moreover, infants are little bodies produced by parent bodies. What else is in there for the real reader of this book about reading the Bible?
The very most important part about this particular book is understanding that we read in community to a certain extent, but other people read the same Bible and they read in different communities. And the idea that we would understand to respect one another across those boundaries. For example, if it's a reader in the Jewish community reading and a reader in the Christian community reading the Old Testament Hebrew Bible, that we would be gracious to one another and realize we're going to see the same text in slightly different ways and how that plays out. And yet a careful reading is going to give content to both of those settings. And so being gracious and sharing the text that way, I think is really high on my list of things that I hope people would take away from that, aside from learning to be good, observant readers of any text. So I think there's parts of this book that are really relevant to Bible reading, but I think there are parts of the book that are equally transferable skills to any book that somebody would want to read.
One of the main premises of the book is that it wants to be a guide, as the subtitle says, rather than a prescription. It entangles for you some of the concepts and the processes that are going on very often unconsciously when we read text and when we read the Bible in particular. It's a reading tool, and the insights from cognitive-stylistics are very useful in that respect, because they pay attention to linguistic and literary features of the text, the approach is easily combined with the main questions people ask the text: historical questions, theological questions, literary questions, philosophical questions. So it's kind of a framework that fits all. Thus, we're talking about a reading tool to help observe what's in the text and what surrounds it, including yourself as a reader. As far as that reader goes, are we then back to as many meanings as there are readers?
I think the text will limit many different ways. But for example, the way one would conceive of the term God or Yahweh and how that's handled in reading, that would be one thing that might be slightly different depending on one's presuppositions. So, but I don't think we can take that and keep running with it until it disappears into the sunset. I think there is a constraint that the text puts on things.
All right, so there is the biblical text, the reader, and the context. Within that frame, there's room for a wide but nevertheless limited variety of interpretations. We read in a context, we read with our mind, and we read with our bodies. Focusing on how we read the Bible might help us understand what we read and how why we read to begin with fits into our act of interpretation.
Okay, so that was the podcast as a conclusion. And I just have a slide up here for those who are interested in this topic. The book I mentioned at the beginning already has a cover and will be out in May. So I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and I welcome any questions or remarks. Thank you.